Welcome to the Heart of the Craft, Compassion and Gratitude in Masonry, Psychology, and Contemplative Practice. I prepared this presentation over a year ago for my address at New York Masonicon. Unfortunately, unexpected events made it necessary for me to withdraw, so I'm sharing it here on my YouTube channel instead. At the outset, I should note that much of what I am about to share comes from two previous works I've done. The first was a lecture entitled Compassion in Masonry, and much of its content is also included and expanded upon in my book, A Rose Qua Oratory. The second was my article, Gratitude in Masonic Life, originally written for issue 56 of the Journal of the Masonic Society. This presentation isn't simply a melding of content from those previous works. It includes new insights from my continuing studies on compassion and gratitude, and I'd like to note that in preparing for it, I read over 20 additional research papers and literature reviews recently published in professional journals. Compassion's Latin roots combine to literally mean suffer with. In the psychology of compassion, its more precise meaning has two parts. First, the empathic awareness of another person or persons suffering. And second is the desire to alleviate that suffering. Some researchers distinguish further between aspirational compassion and active compassion, the latter of which not only wants others to experience relief from suffering, but takes steps to help. As science studies these matters more carefully, we have been learning some things about compassion. One is that compassion is a natural ability. We are biologically predisposed or hardwired, if you will, to be compassionate. It is an instinct. We naturally recognize and relate to the suffering of others as if it is our own. In fact, there are studies showing that young children, chimpanzees, rats, and other non-human animals will take action to help relieve the suffering of others without any training or extrinsic reward. One erroneous view of compassion is that it can't be taught, that you are born with a certain level of compassion and that's that. For instance, a defining characteristic of sociopaths is a lack of compassion, but research into the developmental experiences of sociopaths suggests that rather than being innately incapable of compassion, their capacity for compassion has been impaired by trauma, such as psychological abuse, neglect, or brain injury. We know that we can teach people what compassion is and how to recognize it in themselves. We can develop it, make it stronger, and more consciously integrate it into our lives, just as we would with other natural abilities. And that starts to get to this question: why is it important for Masons to learn more about compassion? Well, for one thing, it is directly addressed in our rituals, and even more frequently alluded to with other terms, some of which we will be examining in a moment. Another reason for contemplating compassion is because the world needs it. Much of the world idolizes competitiveness and individualism. Indeed, these qualities are often held up as bringing out the best in human beings. However, it doesn't take much depth of thought to realize that competitiveness and individualism, unbalanced by compassion, lead to an extremely divisive world where the vices of arrogance, greed, and gluttony reign supreme, and the suffering of others is ignored or exploited. In such a world, engagement with other human beings is dominated by selfish attitudes with very little concern for one's fellows. Anyone who has played team sports knows that these attitudes undermine a team's effectiveness. Furthermore, Teammates who don't genuinely care about each other often quickly turn on each other. It should be no surprise that anthropologists and sociologists observe that without compassion, we could not have evolved into intelligent creatures capable of building civilizations with intricate systems of interconnecting, interdependent specialties. Now, please understand that I'm not saying competitiveness and individualism are inherently bad things, but like anything, they need to be moderated in order to be truly virtuous. Even so, I think it's highly significant that our rituals contain far more teachings relevant to compassion and interdependence than they do to competition and individualism. Given this observation, let's take some time to review elements of our tradition that are directly relevant to compassion. The General Ahiman Rezan of 1868 by Daniel Sickles, once a widely popular monitor of Preston Webb ritual, has both explicit and implicit references to compassion. On brotherly love, it says, quote, "By the exercise of brotherly love, we are taught to regard the whole human species as one family, the high, the low, the rich, the poor, who, as created by one almighty parent, and inhabitants of the same planet, are to aid, support, and protect each other." End quote. On truth, it says, quote, "To be good and true is the first lesson we are taught in Masonry. On this theme we contemplate, and by its dictates endeavor to regulate our conduct. Hence, while influenced by this principle, hypocrisy and deceit are unknown among us. Sincerity and plain dealing distinguish us, and the heart and the tongue join in promoting each other's welfare and rejoicing in each other's prosperity." End quote. On relief, it says, quote, "To relieve the distressed is a duty incumbent on all men, but particularly on Masons, who are linked together by an indissoluble chain of sincere affection. To soothe the unhappy, to sympathize with their misfortunes, to compassionate their miseries, and to restore peace to their troubled minds, is the great aim we have in view. On this basis, we form our friendships and establish our connections." End quote. Now let's consider how the principal tenets connect with what we previously clarified about compassion. What we can see here is that brotherly love accounts for the attending and empathizing aspects of compassion, truth for understanding, and relief for the actual helping. Our principal tenets are the components of active compassion. Preston Webb Ritual and monitors also specifically address the importance and benefits of compassion through the virtue of charity and its allegorical connection with Jacob's ladder. The General Ahiman Rezan says, quote, "A mutual chain of dependence subsists throughout the animal creation. The whole human species are therefore proper objects for the exercise of charity. Beings who partake of one common nature ought to be actuated by the same motives and interests. Hence, to soothe the unhappy by sympathizing with their misfortunes, and to restore peace and tranquility to agitated spirits, constitute the general and great ends of the Masonic institution. This humane, this generous disposition fires the breast with manly feelings and enlivens that spirit of compassion which is the glory of the human frame and which not only rivals but outshines every other pleasure the mind is capable of enjoying. All human passions, when directed by the superior principle of reason, promote some useful purpose. But compassion towards proper objects is the most beneficial of all the affections and excites the most lasting degrees of happiness as it extends to greater numbers and tends to alleviate the infirmities and evils which are incident to human existence. End quote. So, as we have just heard, active compassion can obviously benefit those who are receiving it, but what about those who are giving it? Scientific studies are consistently showing that those who practice compassion can thereby experience many positive effects, including reduced stress, higher self-esteem and self-efficacy, greater happiness, improved immune response, and longer life. Now let's turn our attention to gratitude, which, like compassion, is something that comes naturally to us and which can also be either squelched or developed. A repeated joy for me is finding that the latest research about human wellness, development, and flourishing often expounds on principles and insights that have been carefully examined and fostered in Masonry for generations. We've just seen how I think that's happening on the matter of compassion. However, while reviewing recent scientific literature about gratitude, it was interesting to me that I could not recall much Masonic instruction on it. Masonry teaches extensively about virtue and various attitudes that are conducive to being wiser, stronger, and more beautiful beings. But surprisingly, it does not often specifically explicate gratitude. So, I'm going to share some results from my review of gratitude in Masonic sources, information from research on gratitude, and relevant practices for gratitude's intentional inclusion in a contemplative approach to Masonic life. But before we go any further, we should clarify the literal meaning of gratitude. This step might not seem necessary since it is such a common word, but as with the definition of compassion, there may be some aspects that are worth highlighting. The basic definition of gratitude is the feeling of thankfulness, of being grateful and appreciative. In psychology, further distinctions are made between state gratitude, trait gratitude, and gratitude expression. Simply said, state gratitude is the experience of feeling thankful for something. This feeling generally comes with awareness of one or more benefactors that have been instrumental in providing something for which you are thankful. Benefactors can be one or more individuals, a group of people as a whole, other creatures like pets, or nature, God, yourself, or some combination of these. By contrast, trait gratitude is an abiding quality in a person's character, a more or less stable attitude of gratitude with generalized effects on how one interprets and responds to life's experiences. This quality is a personality trait. It is probably obvious that there is a relationship between state gratitude and trait gratitude. In effect, when the trait of gratitude is stronger in one's character, then the state of gratitude is experienced more frequently because one is more attuned to recognizing the various benefits and benefactors in one's life. The flip side of that coin is that the more often one experiences the state of gratitude, then the more reinforcement there is for the trait of gratitude. However, it is also true that trait gratitude does not necessarily depend on a consistent or high volume of state gratitude experiences or on exceptionally powerful experiences of thankfulness. In fact, research indicates that the more gratitude is present as a trait in one's life, then the more one is likely to recognize benefits and appreciate benefactors that might otherwise be overlooked. A failure to identify and or appreciate benefits and benefactors is what we mean when we speak of something or someone being taken for granted. Trait gratitude helps us avoid that vice, and it also leads to more frequent gratitude expression. Gratitude expression moves from recognition and appreciation of benefits and benefactors to include outward communication about them. In other words, it is speaking or demonstrating one's gratitude in some specific way. Interestingly, just as the vices of greed and gluttony are mitigated by compassion that is not only felt but acted upon, so too are arrogance and narcissism abated by practicing both the attitude and the expression of gratitude. Goodness knows we need less arrogance and narcissism in the world. With these ideas about gratitude state, trait, and expression in mind, let's turn to the relevance of gratitude in Masonry. While gratitude is found in expressions of thanks included in many of our ritual prayers, we do not frequently find it directly addressed in the craft lodge. I remember only two examples. First, in the Ascent of the Liberal Arts and Sciences common to Preston Webb ritual, we learned that music, quote, never sounds with such seraphic harmony as when employed in singing hymns of gratitude to the Creator of the universe, end quote. Then the Master Mason's emblems include the pot of incense, which, quote, glows with fervent heat. So should our hearts continually glow with gratitude to the great and beneficent author of our existence for the manifold blessings and comforts we enjoy. End quote. After looking for gratitude references in our rituals and monitors, I then conducted a brief review of Masonic literature online and in print. To my surprise, even among the works of renowned authors such as Claudy, Haywood, Mackey, Newton, Pike, and Wilmshurst, there are few comments about gratitude or thankfulness other than brief statements of appreciation we owe to the great architect of the universe. Upon review, it might seem perplexing, perhaps even shocking, that Masonic literature has very few overt statements about gratitude and thankfulness toward other people, things, or nature. Yet there are many passages in our rituals and writings where we are encouraged to be benefactors to one another, and to also feel and express admiration, appreciation, affection, and respect for each other. In the psychology of gratitude, there's plenty of evidence that such feelings arise for those we recognize as benefactors in our lives, and thus gratitude is a naturally implicit element of Masonry that deserves more overt attention, especially as psychology develops a clearer understanding of its importance to our personal and social well-being. Gratitude was explored by Brother Eric Marks in his fine article, Gratitude as a Gavel, published by the Midnight Freemasons blog in August of 2020. Brother Marks, a social work and mental health professional, shared personal examples of how the choice to practice gratitude helped him better respond to physical pain and challenges in his relationships. He found that the natural humility within genuine gratitude enabled him to embrace the whole truth of such moments less defensively, taking them as opportunities to more clearly see and release some of his errors and vices, and thus act more virtuously. In other words, Brother Marks has benefited from gratitude as an intentional practice, not leaving his thankfulness as nothing more than a spontaneous emotional reaction to external factors. As we are about to see, contemporary science affirms his insight about practicing gratitude as part of Masonic virtue. Research indicates that gratitude practices tend to result in people reporting benefits in these ways: greater happiness and emotional positivity, appreciation of other people, improved relationships, focus on what one has rather than what one lacks, feelings of awe when encountering beauty, appreciation arising from understanding that life is short, a focus on the positive in the present moment, and positive comparisons of self with others. Also, positive recovery from physical and mental illness, improved sleep, higher energy levels, increased physical activity, greater fitness, and longer life. Research has also affirmed significant connections between gratitude and qualities like humility, empathy, generosity, and kindness. I'm sure it's not necessary for me to explain how many of these things directly relate to Masonic principles and should be of interest to us. It is clear that gratitude is vitally important to our ideals, and that we owe it to others and ourselves to cultivate it in our hearts and minds as a character trait we often outwardly express. Now, as some of you may have already surmised, there's a strong relationship between compassion and gratitude. Compassionate people tend to experience and express more gratitude, and grateful people tend to recognize and demonstrate more compassion. Interestingly, the question about why this relationship exists has only recently begun to receive any scientific attention. And it strongly appears that empathy is the most significant mediator for compassion and gratitude. Earlier, we noted how empathy, the ability to recognize the feelings of others, is a necessary element of compassion. Empathy also plays a role in gratitude. In fact, more than one role. First, studies show that a beneficiary's magnitude of grateful feelings is related to the suffering or sacrifice experienced by the benefactor in performing a compassionate act. In fact, we naturally tend to feel more grateful toward those who we perceive as having paid a higher price in being compassionate toward us. In short, a beneficiary's gratitude is mediated by his or her empathy for the benefactor. Second, research shows that when a beneficiary expresses gratitude, benefactors empathize with those feelings of thankfulness, feel appreciation for them, and in turn are more likely to experience further empathy and compassion for not only the beneficiary, but also for others. Simply said, we typically feel thankful when others show their thankfulness for us, and that motivates us to be more helpful to others. Thus, the benefactor's compassion is reinforced with positive thoughts and feelings, stimulated by empathy with the beneficiary's gratitude. Importantly, the effects of empathy in compassion and/or gratitude are not limited to beneficiaries and benefactors, because the research indicates that observers also benefit from empathizing with other people's expressions of compassion and/or gratitude. Simply said, the positive feelings stimulated by empathically witnessing compassionate or grateful acts encourage us to be more compassionate or grateful. So empathy's pivotal role suggests that its intentional development naturally contributes to practices of both compassion and gratitude. On that note, we turn to the matter of contemplative practice. In the broadest sense, contemplative practice refers to various methods by which people turn their attention inward on something to acquire deeper insight about and even identification with whatever they are attending to. As the Masonic historian and encyclopedist Albert Mackey correctly noted, this was also the meaning of speculative when that term began to be applied to the practice of non-operative accepted Masonry. Within the fraternity, we should continue to use speculative that way today, despite how it may be more often used in the profane world. Our rituals repeatedly employ these two terms, speculative and contemplative, to urge us to set aside time in our lives for penetrating deeper into the allegories and symbols of our tradition. Indeed, the rituals themselves, our efforts to memorize their words or those of Masonic catechisms, and the studies and discussions we engage in about their meanings and applications, these are all contemplative practices of different sorts. One thing I want to emphasize is that contemplative practice isn't just about our moments of searching inwardly in meditation or prayer. For contemplative practice to be complete, it must also have an external dimension, one in which we apply, test, and refine the insights that come to us in those private moments. Masonic tradition makes this very clear, that what we are taught in our lodges and temples must be applied and refined in our lives outside of those sacred spaces. Drawing attention to this contemplative aspect of our tradition and offering ways to go even further with it has been the aim of my Masonic career. In my own practice and witnessing others I have worked with in Masonry and in my profession as a therapist, now retired, I've been fortunate to see such methods have a significant impact on moral, intellectual, and spiritual development, and especially in connection with the faculties of compassion and gratitude. Before I go further, I should state that with time limits for a presentation like this, it is impossible for me to do justice to any single practice or for even one of these faculties. So for now, I am giving you a quick introduction to a few methods that have been proven effective, with hopes that your interest becomes piqued enough to take these as your own entry points into the contemplative quarries of Masonic labor. We start with empathy, since it is vital to both compassion and gratitude. One of the most effective things anyone can do with this faculty is expand and refine their emotional vocabulary. Just as learning and using the names of subtly different flavors refines our palate for food and drink, or learning and using the names of subtly different colors refines our artistic sensibilities, so too does our emotional awareness and understanding benefit from learning and using a broader and more precise collection of emotional terms. For this purpose, one of the best models I know of was developed by the psychologist Robert Plutchik, who was a professor emeritus at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine and adjunct professor at the University of South Florida. His theory of emotion has 10 postulates that are very useful in understanding the logic at work within our feelings, despite our tendency to view logic and emotions as opposed to each other or even entirely disconnected from each other. Rather than get into the finer details of this theory right now, let me instead introduce this diagram, which is Plutchik's wheel of emotions. This wheel uses variations of color to show how 8 primary emotions vary by intensity. The further out on the wheel you look, the lower the intensity. For example, on the red spoke to the left, we find anger varying from rage as the most intense form to annoyance as the least. The wheel also shows how these primary emotions can combine to form compound emotions, and you can see how anger and disgust combine to form contempt. I also want to encourage you to exercise critical thinking with this and any other model of emotions. When I first did so with this wheel, I found one thing with which I strongly disagree. Note that in the upper right quadrant, Plutchik uses the word love to name the compound emotion that combines joy and trust. To me, love isn't just an emotion, and it's certainly not something that can be correlated to just one place on this wheel. My choice for this location would be a word like affection or fondness instead. Despite this criticism, I find Plutchik's wheel to be an excellent starting place for the kind of inner work I'm describing. There are other models with many more terms that you might also want to investigate. To use this wheel for contemplative practice, you begin by examining the words on one of its spokes, and then turning within yourself, using memory to recall and or imagination to stimulate the feelings that naturally accompany the given emotion at different levels of intensity. This feeling includes its intensity or strength, the degree of pleasantness or unpleasantness, and changes in physical sensations in the body, such as temperature, pressure, tingling, changes in muscle tension at different places, like with facial expressions, and perhaps also changes in heart rate and respiration. We have numerous sayings that reveal the commonality of such sensations, like having a lump in my throat, or a pain in my neck, making me sick to my stomach, or having butterflies, making my blood boil, or my heart swell, and so on. It's very helpful to make notes with a pen and paper as you identify situations and feelings that tend to match up with emotional terms. You might never refer to them again, but the simple process of writing them down helps clarify them and anchor them in your memory. In some cases, memory and imagination might not be immediately helpful to you, and that leads us to the next step in this practice. Emotional mindfulness is the effort to be more aware of emotions as they naturally arise in life. You make a commitment to yourself to be alert for the presence of emotion within yourself and in others. This attentiveness is to verbal cues like words and tones of voice, and nonverbal cues like facial expressions, body postures, and gestures. When you become aware of these cues in yourself or others, you do your best to name the emotion or emotions. If they're being observed in another person, it might even be appropriate to check in with that person to verify the accuracy of your assessment. This can easily be done by sharing what you think they are feeling and asking how on or off track you are. Or just asking a question, is this what you're feeling? If you aren't ready to name anything, you just state that you're picking up on some emotion and welcome the person to say more about what they're feeling. People usually respond positively, often with some degree of gratitude, when you simply check in on how they're feeling. Note that when you are practicing these ways of attentiveness in your observations of others, you are literally practicing empathy, intentionally exercising your empathic abilities in order to make them stronger. So that's the contemplative practice with empathy in a nutshell. It is developing your emotional vocabulary by becoming more fluent with emotional terms and applying those terms during emotional mindfulness with yourself and others. The research suggests that just this work can enhance your compassion and gratitude, and you'll very likely see benefits in your relationships as well. So now let's consider a contemplative practice for compassion. We start by thinking of words like these on Plutchik's wheel that we associate with suffering, and we try to recall past experiences in which we have felt those emotions. Then we try to recall past experiences or imagine situations in which we have observed others having those feelings. Making these mental connections helps develop our ability to recognize and relate to the suffering of others. Even so, we resist any temptation to jump to conclusions or judgments about the person's suffering and what is needed to reduce it. This basic level of acknowledging the mystery of other people's experiences is a healthy kind of humility and naturally points toward the next step in this practice, which is to seek further understanding. Whenever possible, this should be done by speaking with the person who is suffering, trying to see things from their perspective. Notice how this process begins with emotions and gradually shifts toward gaining a better cognitive grasp of how the person is being affected, which in turn facilitates the process of determining how we might effectively help ease their suffering. In many cases, just these steps of noticing another's difficulties, inquiring about their feelings, and seeking to better understand their situation is itself the most compassionately helpful thing we can do. In fact, sometimes the urge to provide solutions isn't very respectful or helpful at all. Furthermore, being in a rush toward solutions is often based on our own desire to feel better than it is to do what is actually in the other person's best interests. Our actions have become more about serving our own egos and selfishness. Thus, we see that humility is another quality that the practice of genuine compassion has in common with gratitude. With regard to the contemplative practice of gratitude, there is one method that has been tested more than any other single approach, and it has proven to be remarkably effective, despite being incredibly simple. That practice is daily gratitude journaling, and it requires nothing more than making a short list of things you are grateful for. Studied as a 5-minute per day practice, participants in gratitude journaling also reported many of the benefits previously listed for gratitude. Bedtime seems to be optimal for this practice since the data shows that doing so is particularly conducive to better sleep in a number of ways. One of the advantages of gratitude journaling is that research participants were more likely to follow through with gratitude journaling than with other well-being practices. This appears to be due to the ease of the method, but perhaps also because of the immediate reward of pleasant feelings. With regard to the emotional side of the practice, there are also likely to be benefits specifically from allowing oneself to momentarily dwell on the pleasant feelings of gratitude connected with the things one lists in this exercise. The idea here is that such feelings accompany the release of beneficial chemicals in your body, and by dwelling on the feelings, we give those chemicals more time to affect us. Now, to take this listing practice from the internal to the external, the next step would be to express your gratitude for one or more listed items to someone, preferably to the actual benefactors when that is possible. Keep in mind that this may not need to be done in private, although good judgment should always be exercised on that point. As we have seen, gratitude expressions are beneficial to everyone. The benefactor to whom one is grateful, to oneself as the beneficiary, and to observers not directly involved. In conclusion, Empathy, compassion, and gratitude are so entirely consonant with the virtues of Masonry that one cannot be true to our tradition without them. Contemplative practices focused on them, practices that include both internal meditations and external engagement, are scientifically validated methods to significantly improve our lives and benefit the people we connect with. I hope that I have both challenged and encouraged you to more thoroughly consider these matters for yourself, and perhaps even begin to employ one or more of these methods as part of your Masonic toolkit. Thank you for joining me in this consideration of gratitude and compassion at the heart of our craft. I wish you more of both in your life.